Fort Mackinac rifle firing demonstration on the parade ground in front of the soldiers' barracks. The best place to view this demonstration is from the porch of the soldiers' barracks or the glass fences below. Again, in just a few minutes, we will begin the Fort Mackinac rifle firing demonstration on the parade ground in front of the soldiers' barracks.
In practice, their military duties here at the fort kept them from working in the park. Some of those duties included maintaining the walls and buildings of the fort, which were some parts over 100 years old by the time the 23rd was stationed here. They'd also had to practice their marching on this field right here for at least 2 hours every day and go to the rifle range to practice their marksmanship at least twice a week. But that was a new concept for the Army. You see, people may think that this is still the Civil War era, but we're 20 years disconnected from that. And the tactics and technology have changed greatly. Only in the Civil War, again about 20 years prior, soldiers had to line up in very long lines, tens of hundreds of soldiers long, firing semi-accurate muzzle-loading rifles and muskets at each other. Now, those weapons were only accurate to 200 or 300 yards, so you needed to be close to your enemy, which is why those casualty rates during the Civil War were so high. Those weapons were also pretty difficult to actually load and use properly. Soldiers would have to take a paper cartridge that has their powder and shot inside of it. They'd have to rip the top off, pour everything down their barrel, take out their ramrod, shove it all down to the breech end or the back end of the barrel, bring the rifle back up, put a little thing called a percussion cap on it to prime it, and then they would have to wait for an order to fire. Even trained soldiers would only be able to shoot about 2 to 3 aim shots a minute using those techniques and that technology. But after the Civil War, things began to change as the Plains Wars began. Now, the Plains Wars were an undeclared series of wars in the American West where the government was fighting against Native American tribes. Now, unfortunately for the American government and the U.S. Army in particular, once fighting these Native Americans, the natives didn't play by the traditional rules of war. They wouldn't just line up and wait to be shot. They would be in small groups moving around the plains rapidly, targeting different objectives. And the Army needed to compensate in order to do their job. The biggest one was, well, making sure that the settlers, the American civilians out in the West, were safe from these Native American war parties. So they adopted new tactics. One of them is called skirmishing, where you have small teams doing the same thing. Small teams moving across the plains, taking their objectives quickly. But with muzzle-loading weapons, it's quite difficult to actually do that, as you have to stop them for 20 or 30 seconds in order to reload. So the Army adopted a new rifle to try and give their soldiers an edge. And this is that rifle. It was adopted in 1873, which is why it is called the Springfield Model 1873, also known as the Springfield Trapdoor. Now, this may look like a muzzleloader, but it is a breech-loading weapon. So remember what I said earlier, nothing happens up here, everything happens down here at the breech end of the barrel, the back. All a soldier would have to do to load this is bring the hammer back twice, open a rising breech block, which is actually why the rifle has the nickname of trapdoor, because the breech block looks like a trapdoor. Then he would take a very modern-looking cartridge to insert. This is the 4570 Government, which today is a popular hunting round, but back then this was the standard issue cartridge for the military. It was tipped with a 45 caliber, so just under ½ inch in diameter, 500 grain lead bullet at the top, with 70 grains of black powder within the case, and a center fire primer in the rear to ignite it. A soldier would simply take this round, stick it in the chamber of his rifle, close that breech block, bring the hammer back one more time, and he was ready to fire 12 to 15 aimed shots per minute. Quite an increase from that 2 to 3 with muzzleloaders. But what good is putting all that lead downrange if you can't hit your targets? That's where the target practice comes into play. On Mackinac Island, they built 2 rifle ranges for those troops to practice on. One was a 1,000-yard range over by Sugarloaf Rock on the east side of the island, and the other is actually started right behind the fort where the North Gate is today. In fact, if you actually look towards Fort Holmes, you are looking down the old 600-yard rifle range. It's why you can see Fort Holmes from the fort. Now, remember, the soldiers had to go out at least twice a week to practice, and the Army wanted to encourage them to do the best that they could. They found the easiest way to encourage these soldiers was to give them awards. So if they could shoot good enough, they would qualify at 2 different levels. One is marksman, where if a soldier was on that 600-yard range, he would have to hit a 6-foot by 6-foot target 80% of the time. If he could do that, then the Army would give him a badge and he would qualify as a marksman. About 40 of the soldiers here at Fort Mackinac were able to do that. But if a soldier could do one better and hit a same target, so 6-foot by 6-foot target, again, consistently, about 18% of the time, but this time at 1,000 yards, he would qualify as a sharpshooter, again, given some additional badges to wear. And about a dozen soldiers here at Fort Mackinac actually qualify as sharpshooters. So figure, we have just over 50 soldiers who have qualified on this new marksmanship award system. There are only about 100 soldiers here at Fort Mackinac, so half of the soldiers are considered to be some exceptionally good shots. And that actually does show. When Fort Mackinac sent their rifle firing team to an Army-wide marksmanship competition, they took 3rd place. This little garrison on an island in the middle of a lake, in the middle of nowhere, took 3rd place in a marksmanship competition against the other 25,000 soldiers of the Army. Wow. I'd say that's pretty impressive. But unfortunately, I cannot do them any honor today, as I don't have bullets and there's more than a few safety concerns with me shooting live ammunition within the fort. One thing I can do, though, is show you how rapidly this weapon is able to fire, as I do have blanks. But before I get into shooting, I'm going to put in my historically inaccurate bright orange foam earplugs, because this will be quite loud. Though we are outdoors, the sound will reflect around a lot, right into your ears. So I would suggest taking your much more historically accurate earplugs located on the ends of your fingers and using those instead.
Well, I hope that was loud enough for everybody. So as you can see from all this smoke that I just made, this is still using black powder, which gives a literal meaning to the term fog of war. This weapon would only be in service with the Army for about 20 years before they got rid of it, replacing it with more modern bolt-action rifles, which use smokeless powder. Though not truly smokeless, like a lot less smokeless than that. Now folks, if you have any questions about anything that I've just talked about, or if you'd like to check out this rifle, I'll be right over here collecting my brass for a few moments before beginning our next tour, which will be the changing face of Fort Mackinac. And that is going to take you through the 115-year service history of this fort and how it changed over that time. So, once again, thank you for attending this demonstration, and please enjoy the rest of your time here at Fort Mackinac.
Not actually with the fort, actually with the area. This is the Straits of Mackinac, which have been culturally and historically significant for thousands of years, before the first Americans even knew, or the first Europeans even knew what America was. So, this island has actually been inhabited by Native Americans for thousands of years. And they would use this, as many people do today, more or less as a summer resort. They would come here in the summer to camp out on the beaches. They would set up all their longhouses, tents, what have you. And they would just do things. They would hunt here, they would fell trees, they would meet with family members they haven't seen in a long amount of time, settle their differences, trade, and even bury their dead. Actually, Mackinac Island is almost one giant graveyard because of how many dead that actually got buried here. Mind you, there thousands of years of natives were coming to this island. So, in the 1600s, the first Americans, or the first, I keep saying Americans, the first Europeans came to North America, and those were the French. Now, they did a lot of exploring in the Great Lakes region. Most of Michigan, Ohio, Canada, those portions were actually first charted out by the natives. However, the French weren't here to conquer. They were just here to explore and get in on the fur trade. Now, there are a huge amount of fur-bearing animals in this region in particular, and they're wanted for two good reasons. One, in Europe, they're used to make fashion items, and two, fur keeps you warm. It gets very cold up here. So the French were very eager to actually get in on that fur trade, and the natives were very willing to trade furs for stuff that they may have needed. Finished blankets, arms, ammunition, food, all of that kind of stuff. So the French would continue with that relationship with the natives in this area until the 1760s, when they lost the French and Indian War. Now, we call it the French and Indian War, but they over there call it the 7 Years' War, because this was part of a larger conflict between Great Britain and France. Now, unfortunately, France did lose the war, so they had to give up their North American holdings, which you have to remember, those colonies on the East Coast, all 13 of them, were British colonies. Everything west of that, all the way to the Mississippi, was New France, including all of Canada. Everything west of the Mississippi was New Spain. So the British had just took over the French holdings. They took over Canada, and they took over everything up to the Mississippi River. So now the French were out of here, and the British wanted to continue that relationship with the Native Americans, because there were a lot of them, and they wanted to keep going with that fur trade. A little bit earlier in this region, the French built a fort, a stockaded fort over there, which is just those big pointy wooden walls, right over there. And it was called Mackinac, which is the traditional native name for this region. But that was more or less just a wall around a city in order to protect the people inside of it. When the British took it over, it actually got turned into a military fort. It was called Fort Mackinac. They had soldiers in there, and if you actually look outside of the fort today, it looks a lot different, because back then it would have looked like a city outside of the fort. There were hundreds of buildings built all around it. In the 1770s, there was a man named Patrick Sinclair, and he was the governor of British Canada, and he was put in charge of that fort along with this portion of what was then British Canada, which encompassed, well, Canada and what is today Michigan. But he had some concerns with the fort. Now, there's some major problems with it. Now, as a trading outpost, it's amazing because it's right on the beach. All you have to do is walk a few yards out and you're in the water. That's where all the canoes are coming to drop off those furs. But as a military fort, it is not good. Now, the fort itself
only had one level of wall, stockades. There were civilians mixed in with the population, and it was very small, which is why there were so many buildings outside of the fort. So he decided that he wanted to build a new fort in a more defensible location. Now, he served on the Great Lakes as a naval officer during the French and Indian War, and he had experience on the island. In fact, he'd been here multiple times before with some of those natives. So he sent out a survey party to this island in 1779 to actually begin scouting locations to build a fort. They chose this location for a few reasons. Anybody like to guess?
It's tall.
That's one of them. This is 150 feet above sea level. Anybody else think of any ideas? That's another one too. So this has a very commanding view of the Straits of Mackinac. Anything else? What do you guys think these buildings are made of?
Limestone.
Limestone. Mackinac Island is pretty much one giant limestone rock, so they had plentiful building materials here. They didn't have to bring these stones over from the mainland. For the walls and this building right here, which we'll talk about in a bit, they were able to quarry everything right here. Now with that as well, this harbor right here is the only natural harbor on the island. If you take away all the buildings, it would look largely the same. So they wanted this fort to be able to defend that. Now the other thing, and perhaps the one reason why this fort was built, was to better defend the civilians that were facilitating the fur trade. That was making the British government a lot of money. So Patrick Sinclair essentially told them, I will build a fort to protect you if you move to this island. So the village was set up there, and that's why the fort is in this location. In 1780, they actually broke ground on the fort. If we walk this way, I'll tell you a little bit about how the fort looked. Now, the first thing is this building right here. This was actually one of two buildings that they built specifically for the fort. So the south wall, the east wall, and the west wall look largely the same as they did before. But this building right here, the officers' stone quarters, I think that name was self-explanatory. It's a quarters made of stone for officers. It was built in 1780. And actually, this is the oldest confirmed building. They also built another building about where the commissary stands today. That's one building right on the corner of the parade ground. And that was a powder magazine, which is where they would store all of their powder. Otherwise, Patrick Sinclair was actually quite a resourceful man. He brought over quite a few buildings from Fort Mackinac. He brought over a guardhouse, which sits in the same location as the guardhouse today. He brought over a barracks, which sits in about that location as well. It was a one-story, four-room log cabin-looking building. He also brought over a storehouse, just a big rectangular cabin that was a warehouse that was in about the same location as the post hospital today. Now that building actually pulled triple duty. Not only was it a storehouse, it was also the mess hall and the hospital. So it was pretty cramped in there. Now, as I said, the east, west, and southern walls largely looked the same, but the northern wall looked significantly different. Imagine a wall going from this hill right here all the way over to the north side of the fort. And that was considered to be the main wall of the fort, but it was not made of stone. It was wood filled with dirt. Now, they had a few defensive features to make it, well, more defensible from the north. One feature called a ravelin is a disconnected wall in front of that one. So what that makes it so is that the enemy, if they want to attack that wall, has to go around the ravelin in order to get to your main wall. Additionally, they built a ditch, which just artificially makes the wall taller. And they built these little defensive features called bastions. Now imagine your wall is flat like this. So if you have all your men up here shooting out, they can only shoot perpendicular to the wall, just straight out like that. But if you build bastions, they are triangular shapes, built one on each corner. Now, men can stand on those bastions and shoot parallel to the wall, which makes it more defensible. Construction was going quite well, but in 1782, the British government sent a team of Royal Engineers to Fort Mackinac to inspect it. They knew Patrick Sinclair was building a fort, but they didn't really know what else he was doing. He was actually a little bit secretive with it. So when they got here and they did their overview of the fort, they were disgusted with what they saw. Now, the fort was incomplete. He had spent 3 years on this, and it was an incomplete fort. Those walls had more or less just little picket fences on them that children could crawl over. So not very defensible. That north wall was garbage compared to the rest of these. The fort was too large for the garrison that was here. There were about 100 men here. They would have needed at least 300 to defend the fort. they also found that this is not the highest point on the island. The highest point of the island lies about half a mile to the north, and that is where Fort Holmes is today. We'll talk about that in a bit. But Patrick Sinclair knew that, and his reasoning was that if he had a fort up there, he wouldn't be able to defend the town, which was the purpose of this fort. Now, perhaps the absolute worst part for the British government wasn't the fact that the fort was incomplete, not that it was too large, not that it had very bad design. Mind you, fort design at this time was an art. People spent their entire lives dedicated to learning it. Patrick Sinclair was not a fort builder. In fact, most of the sketches for this fort are found in the margins of letters he wrote to people. The worst part of all of this is the amount of money he spent. Now, think back, this is the 1790s. British pounds. How many do you guys think he sold, he used to build this fort?
$100 million.
A lot less than $1 million, but still a lot of money. Anybody else? Well, he spent 100,000 pounds building this fort, which today equals out to a few million pounds. But that was absolutely unacceptable, so he was relieved of command almost instantly. By this time, the American Revolution was coming to a close. Not on terms favorable to Great Britain. They knew that this land was going to become part of the United States. So they decided that eventually this land will become part of the United States. Why are we going to do anything to this fort? And we're also not going to move until they make us. So, from 1782 until 1796, the British occupied this fort, even though it was technically American territory. The worst part is that they didn't do anything to maintain the fort. Buildings were collapsing. The stone quarters wasn't even finished by the British. It was 4 walls. No roof, no floor, no doors, windows, anything. It was just 4 walls. The Americans did show up in 1796, removed the British from the fort. They retreated to St. Joseph Island, which sits about 40 miles north of Mackinac. But they saw everything here and they were disgusted. If more so because of how dilapidated the fort looked at this point. It went through a period of disuse. So the Americans spent a lot of time upgrading the fort. One of the first things they did is they knocked down that big interior wall and they moved it out to the modern position that it's in today. Additionally, they built 3 new structures, which are actually on the east, north, and west. If you look over to the east, you'll see that big 2-story building on the hill, and that is a blockhouse. It is meant to be the defensive center of the fort. Soldiers would be able to defend the fort from there. Those little holes on top are for shooting muskets out of, and the big holes are for shooting cannons out of. So even if the walls of the fort were breached, soldiers would be able to lock themselves in there and still defend the fort. Those would be put to the test during another war that began in 1812. You folks follow me? Does anybody want to venture to guess what that war is called? War of 1812. There you go. It's the War of 1812. Now for this next portion, I'm actually going to take you outside of the walls of the fort because there is a very important structure relating to the War of 1812 right out there. Now just a little bit of backstory to the War of 1812. It was declared by the American government on Great Britain. And there were a few reasons for the war being declared. The largest ones being the impressment of American sailors, meaning that British vessels were essentially forcing American sailors at gunpoint to work for the British government without pay. The Americans didn't like that. The other thing is that the British were actively supplying arms and ammunition to disrupt American trade and settlement of the West. That was a very big issue because they just kept doing it over and over and over. So the Americans declared war in early 1812. But there's a problem with that. The American government sent military orders through the post office. The British have designated military couriers. So those men's only job is to ride from horseback as fast as they can from one location to another in order to pass orders. So the British got their orders first. When they set sail for Mackinac Island in early 1812, they came with a force of British regulars, Canadian militia, and Native American mercenaries. They landed on the northeast side, or the northwest, side of the island, which is where British landing is. In fact, that's why it's called British Landing. Now, when they did land, they overlanded a single cannon out to the hill right behind this fort. Not where Fort Holmes is, But if you take away all this vegetation, there's a little hill that only sits about 100 to 200 yards back. They mounted that cannon there and just waited. They sent a letter to the fort with a courier requesting that the commander, Lieutenant Porter Hanks, surrender. Now, he read this letter and said, why would I surrender? But when he looked out, he didn't like what he saw. Not only was that cannon pointed at his fort, but there were 600 British soldiers staring him down. Now, that's combined the British regulars, the militia, and the Native Americans, but he couldn't possibly defend the fort with the amount of men that he had. They had 600, and he had 57 that could fight. So the fort was surrendered without a shot fired. Now, Lieutenant Hanks, along with the rest of the garrison, were actually released on their good word that they would not take up arms against the British government until they were exchanged for British prisoners, which is pretty nice. So they went to the next nearest American garrison, which is at Fort Wayne, not Indiana, Fort Wayne, Detroit. When they got there, Lieutenant Hanks was actually to be court-martialed for cowardice in surrendering the fort. As he was about to testify for his court-martial, the British attacked Fort Wayne. The cannonball came through the wall, killed him instantly. And so this fort would remain in possession of the British until the end of the war. That fort, right up there on the hill, yep, you can sort of see it right through the trees over there. That is Fort Holmes, which is what the British built to secure the high ground. That is the highest point on the island, and the British built that specifically to defend. Now, this island would be attacked again by the Americans attempting to take the fort back, but it would fail all three times. At first, by sea, they attempted to shoot at the fort. Well, the Americans couldn't elevate their guns high enough, and the British were bad shots defending the fort with cannons, so nobody died on either side. They tried to take it back by land. In fact, by this time, the Americans outnumbered the British 2-1. But the Americans got flanked and they had to retreat. Finally, the Americans actually blockaded the port so that the soldiers here would starve. The British sent 2 canoes down with 15 men each and took both ships as war prizes. So all 3 attempts failed. So the British would hold this fort until 1815, when the Treaty of Ghent was signed, which ended the War of 1812. Now, the terms of the treaty essentially just antebellum status quo, which just means that anything that was in possession by one country before the war had to be returned to that country. And so Fort Mackinac and Mackinac Island would come back into American possession for the final time. Now, after this, the Americans started to upgrade this fort because they didn't want something like that happening again. So instead of having the 60 men they had here before, or the 100 men that the British had, they put 300 men at this fort. It may seem quite large, but it's not. Mind you, they still had that 4-room, 1-story barracks right here, and nowhere near enough housing. There were troops living out of the storehouse, there were troops living out of the barracks, out of the blockhouses, camping on the parade ground, and even camping down on the beach. So they started to build new. That one building right there, that wood one, the wood quarters, was actually built in 1816 to try and alleviate that personnel housing issue. So that was actually taken over as officer housing, as officers were previously living in both the stone quarters and the guardhouse. Now, towards the end of the 1820s, early 1830s, they actually started building some additional buildings, and that's when the fort started to become a lot more modern. They tore down the original British barracks, and they built a new one, because the building was about double its lifespan, so it was starting to fall apart, quite literally. There were soldiers falling through the floors. So one of the last buildings they built in this time frame is actually this one right here, the Hill Quarters, which was built as housing for officers, specifically the commanding officer. It's a duplex. Down there, where the commissary sits today, they built a row of buildings, and they were mostly just shops. The powder magazine was still there, but they had a quartermaster storehouse where the army would store all of the goods for the soldiers. They would keep a blacksmith and a baker back there as well, as remember they have horses, they have need for iron goods, and they would need a baker to, well, make their bread. They built all of those buildings over there, and the fort really started to become a nicer place. They actually built one of this building right over here. This is the Post Hospital. It was built in 1828. That's the second post hospital. The first one was built in 1827 in the same location. It looks exactly the same, but it burned down. Funnily enough, it burned down 10 days before it was supposed to open on Halloween. So it burned, and they rebuilt in the exact same spot. you'll realize this as I'm going through Fort Mackinac's history. Not only are things going to become very dilapidated over time because of disuse, but things are going to burn down a lot. So we keep going this way. So at this point, something else started to happen which made Fort Mackinac lose its military significance, which was that the fur trade was dying. By this point, all of the traders are moving west, and all of the fur-bearing animals in this region have almost been put into extinction. So, the one thing that Fort Mackinac was here to defend is now dying. So, they actually started to remove troops from the fort. And even then, by this point, the army was just refusing to give money to actually keep this fort in running order. In fact, they had neither the authorization nor manpower to buy a single nail to fasten a shingle. It got that bad. The army wouldn't let them do anything. Funnily enough, actually, that hill quarters, when it was first built, it was only half of the duplex. So they essentially just covered the other half with tar paper. The commanding officer had to beg the Secretary of War to finish the building because he said, "Don't finish this building, I'm going to freeze to death in the winter." So by this point, Fort Mackinac is going through another period of dilapidation. Soldiers are getting pulled out to fight in other wars. For example, the Seminole War in the late 1830s down in Florida, all the soldiers got pulled out to fight. They come back, and then in the late 1840s, during the Mexican War, all the soldiers get pulled out to fight. Then in the Civil War, all the soldiers get pulled out to fight. Every time those soldiers came back, they would build, maintain, but otherwise they would just get pulled out again. Actually, in the 1850s, that's when Fort Mackinac started to go through another period of growth. So this is in between the Mexican War and the Civil War. They started to build of course, on the other side of the fort, you have the new post hospital, along with the stewardess quarters, but they actually had to rebuild some other stuff. In the late 1840s, that whole line of shops right there burned down. So, they cleared the rubble, and they rebuilt. They rebuilt the baker, they rebuilt the blacksmith, and they took down that quartermaster's storehouse that was in the middle, and built two buildings on top of it. Once we get over there, you'll see it. One was a new quartermaster's storehouse, but the other was an office to act as the post's headquarters. Now that fire also spread over to the barracks, and the barracks burned. So, it fell down, and they rebuilt it. This is the third barracks that they built at this point, and we don't actually know what the next one looked like, because that one burned down 2 years after it was built. What happened is that baker was actually right behind the original barracks, and most of these buildings are made of wood, with wood roofs. This baker is putting out hot embers through that chimney all day, so it would land on the roof and it would destroy it. To fix that, they put water cisterns underneath the buildings to help fight those fires. But they never really thought that the building that would be on fire was the one that sits over the cistern. So this building was built in 1859, which is the most modern barracks we have. As you can see, it actually looks a lot different. The rest of the barracks were all one-story buildings. This one's a two-story building, because on the ground floor, that's where the soldiers lived. On the upper floor, they had a chapel, a storeroom, and some other things that they could keep up there. The rear wing was the mess hall. Now, the fort would still be in a period of disuse throughout all of this time, but in 1875, Fort Mackinac got a new lease on life when Mackinac National Park was founded. Now, one of the main reasons why they founded Mackinac National Park was just because the soldiers here would act as the caretakers, or more or less, the park rangers. The park rangers didn't exist at this point, so they just used soldiers for it. So they started to upgrade this fort even more. They needed more men, so they took out that second story of the barracks, and they made it into additional housing. But they started to build some other things here as well. That commissary was a building to store fresh food for the soldiers. They wouldn't have to scrounge for food or eat poor quality stuff anymore. Now they could get fresh food from that commissary, which could be cooked in the mess hall right behind the barracks. That white building up on the hill is the reading room, which was a schoolhouse for the soldiers. Remember, at this time, compulsory education was not a thing, so the soldiers got the education their parents gave them. That is where the soldiers were educated, and they could also read on their free time. There was a lending library with about 600 books. Right over here, they actually built a bathhouse where the soldiers could enjoy fresh water baths whenever they wanted. You may wonder where they got that water, though. It's actually from that north blockhouse. The post commander wrote to the quartermaster general asking if he could demolish it, as the fort was starting to expand outside of the walls. But the quartermaster general said that he could not demolish it, as that is a historic relic and one of the only examples of American Revolutionary style architecture in this part of the country. He couldn't demolish it, but he could turn it into something else. He turned it into a water tower. There's a 100-barrel tank installed on the second level of that, and it was fed by a pump where the Grand's Hotel is to the west of the fort today. That steam pump would pump water up. The water would flow down through gravity to the bathhouse, which is this last building in the stack over here. The soldiers could enjoy fresh baths with hot water. They had a water boiler in there. And remember, this is the first location on Mackinac Island to get running water in general. Then things started to get even better. That wood quarters was no longer needed for housing, so they rebuilt it, I should say, as a canteen and post exchange. Soldiers could buy luxury goods in there, along with buying some light snacks, refreshments, alcohol, no whiskey though, and they could play games in there as well. So Fort Mackinac was starting to become a very desirable station for soldiers, as by this point, Mackinac Island was a tourist destination. It was a national park. There's absolutely no chance of you having to fight here. But like all good things, it did come to an end. And in 1895, after a recession, the U.S. government was looking for ways to cut costs because they had no money. Now, one of the biggest things on their shopping block was Mackinac National Park, but they had never decommissioned a national park by this point, so they were wondering what to do. They thought that maybe they could sell the land off to a developer who would strip the island bare of natural resources, but that died. Then they thought of parceling off the land and selling it to private individuals to build houses. That didn't work either. The idea that won out was actually transferring the land to the state of Michigan. And in 1895, when the fort officially closed and the last soldiers marched out, Mackinac National Park and Fort Mackinac became Mackinac State Park, Michigan's first state park. And it's been in our possession since, which is why you see all the buildings here so well maintained. Now, we've been lucky over the last 100 or so years, and we've had no fires. So all of these buildings are actually still original. That stone quarters is the original building. All those stones that you see on the wall were laid by British soldiers back in the 1780s. All of these other buildings were built by the soldiers. They didn't pull in contractors. So if you go inside, just know that you are literally walking through and touching history. Now, folks, this does conclude our Changing Face of Fort Mackinac tour. If anybody has any questions on anything I've talked about, I would be glad to answer them. Our next demonstration is actually going to be probably pretty soon. Does anybody have the time? 10:48. Okay, I did better than I expected on time. Our next demonstration is going to be a cannon firing at 11, straight up those black stairs right next to the commissary. So, once again, thank you for attending, and please enjoy the rest of your time here at Fort Mackinac.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Where's the cup?
Well, I don't want to block.
Charlotte, you don't have to do it yet. We'll tell you when to cover. But he's going to talk about it for a minute. It's only going to make a loud noise at the end.
All right. Well, good morning, folks. How are you all doing here today?
Great.
Excellent. Good to hear. Welcome all then to our Fort Mackinac cannon firing demonstration. My name is Sage. I'm joined up here by Calvin, and we are the two soldiers who are going to be firing off this cannon for you all today. But before we do that, though, I do want to tell you just a little bit about the soldiers that we are dressed to represent, and a little bit about the cannon itself. So, for starters, we're dressed to represent the soldiers of the 23rd Regiment of United States Infantry, Company E, that was stationed here at Fort Mackinac from 1884 to 1890. And these soldiers are stationed here for a rather unique purpose, as they are not here for any combat detail, but instead are serving as the caretakers for what was then the Mackinac Island National Park. So these soldiers are up here for a fairly peaceful posting. simply monitoring that national park and maintaining this fort as a military facility. But they're also going to be up here, well, in the middle of a tourist destination. That national park is bringing tourists here from around the United States, very similar to what you all are doing here today, coming to visit us here at the modern state park. So, of course, tourists came here along the island not only to visit the park, but also to visit the fort and the soldiers themselves. The soldiers even invited these tourists inside the fort twice a week to come watch you perform special dress ceremonies and parades, and even occasionally what was known as a salute shot. Now, what a salute shot is where they would take a cannon like this one here, load it with a black powder charge with no cannonball inside. It's just to make a loud bang to celebrate something. And here at Fort Mackinac, the soldiers had plenty of things to celebrate during that time. Such as daily routines, they fire off this cannon for the raising the flag in the morning or lowering of the flag in the evening. They also fire off the cannon for local events here too, such as the celebration of the Commandant's birthday or welcoming the first boat of tourists coming to the island after a long winter, or even the 4th of July. Where on the 4th of July, they fire what is known as a national salute. That is where they fire off their cannon a total of 38 times, celebrating one shot for each state of the Union. The whole ceremony starting at 5 o'clock in the morning to really kick off that 4th of July celebration and give everyone a rather rude wake-up call. But nevertheless, though, when they are going to be firing off these cannons for the salute shots, they'll be firing a cannon very similar to the one that we have for you all today. And this cannon in particular is known as the Model 1841 6-pound smoothbore field gun. Now, that is a very long and a very technical name. So most of the time, the soldiers refer to this cannon by its more popular name, that being the 6-pounder. But that rather long technical name tells you everything you need to know about this cannon. Model 1841 is the year that this cannon enters service in the U.S. Army. It is also a smoothbore gun, so that means there is no rifling or machine grooves that are carved inside the barrel to put a spiral on the bullet to give it a more stable trajectory so it is much more accurate at much further distance. Instead, this is, well, just basically a tube. That cannonball, well, it has a effective range of about a mile, so roughly all the way up to the shores of Round Island there. Well, with that rather limited accuracy, the smallest target we're really going to reliably hit at that mile-long distance is going to be about the size of Round Island out there. So, not a fairly accurate cannon at that distance. The more effective range, the more kind of accurate range where you want to kind of hit a ship-sized target is going to be at the half-mile mark, so just out to the end of the stone breakwall out there. Now, this is also a field gun. So what that means is that this has, well, these two rather giant wheels here on this rather large carriage. The idea is this is going to be a very mobile cannon. It's going to be hooked up to a team of horses and a crew of 10 men who are going to be wheeling this cannon across a battlefield very, very quickly. Though you might have also noticed that, well, if it's a field gun, if it's meant for mobility, what is it doing here at a fort where it's not going to be moving around all that much? And that's one of the reasons why they're sending these type of cannons here at Fort Mackinac because, well, Fort Mackinac is not very militarily important by the 1880s. Again, it's just overseeing a national park. They don't need a modern and really more practical artillery at this time because by the 1880s they do have much more modern and much more impressive artillery, but Fort Mackinac only needs cannons for salute shots that are happening here at this time. So they're not going to send them the latest and greatest pieces of artillery, they just send them these old Civil War surplus cannons for those salute shot purposes. But now that you all are kind of familiar with the cannon itself and what it's doing here at Fort Mackinac, I say now is a good time that we now step back and fire off that salute shot in honor of you all coming to visit us here at Fort Mackinac this morning. How does that sound? Oh, come on, folks. I know it's early in the morning here, but we're firing a cannon for y'all. How does that sound? Now, before we start loading the charge, though, we first have to go through a couple of safety procedures before we can load in said cannon charge. For our last shot that we fired this morning, it might have left some smoldering debris or embers in the base of the barrel. And if we put a live cannon charge in those embers, that can lead to a premature detonation of the cannon charge. That's going to be a very bad ending for Calvin's day as he's working here at the front end of the cannon. So in order to get those embers out, we have to do what is called thumb stalling. So that means I'm going to take this leather gauntlet and cover this touch hole. Make sure no air goes in to stoke up those embers. All the while, Calvin is going to remove those embers with the auger or gunner's worm. Now, if he does find anything today, though, it will be some historically inaccurate aluminum foil. We use aluminum foil to wrap our charges rather than the more historically accurate muslin cloth. But we found that muslin cloth has a tendency to burn and smolder, and we don't want to send any smoldering debris down into Marquette Park to cause a fire. Now with that, the next tool we're going to be using here is what's called the wet swab. It is a piece of sheep's wool tacked on the end of the rammer, and this is going to be used to douse any potential sparks or embers in water, as well as to cut off air circulation inside of the cannon, combined with my thumb stalling here. So that means that with that thunk there, that vacuum that we created collapsing, we are now ready to load in the cannon charge. Now normally to fire a salute shot here at Fort Mackinac, the soldiers would use 10 ounces of black powder. However, we found that 10 ounces was a little excessive. I have a nasty habit of spooking the horses down on Main Street, and I don't know about you all, but I like to keep a friendly relationship with the carriage tour drivers. So we lowered the charge down to 5 ounces, still loud enough for you to kind of get the idea of what the cannon would sound like, but not too loud to spook said horses. Again, we don't want to cause a stampede down Main Street. But now that we have the cannon loaded, we are now ready to push this cannon forward and into its firing position. And now all that's left to do is to prime the cannon. So at this stage, Calvin is going to take this brass spike, it's called a gimlet, he's going to run it down the touch hole, and that's going to poke a hole into the cannon charge. That is going to reveal the gunpowder for our ignition device. Now the device we're using to light off this cannon is the same device they used back in the 1880s to fire off this piece of artillery. And that is what is called a friction primer. Now a friction primer is simply a small brass tube that is filled with very fine gunpowder. At the top there's a chemical known as fulminate of mercury, and it has a pin running through it. The idea is that we're going to pull this pin, and that will create friction in the fulminate of mercury. This will in turn create sparks. And those sparks light off the gunpowder inside the tube, sending a small jet of flame down into the touch hole. And that is going to ignite our cannon charge for us all today. But now that we are ready to go, it is also at this time I do have to remind you that this is a cannon. Most of the sound will go out to the harbor, but it will still be quite loud. So I do recommend you either cover your ears or get your cameras ready, whatever your priorities are. Alright, and with that, there are now only 2 commands left to fire the cannon.
Jack.
They are ready! Fire! And there you have it, a cannon salute welcome you. Thank you so much for attending our cannon firing demonstration. At this point, if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them while we're going to be cleaning the cannon here. If not, our next demonstration will be at 11:30. That is the People of Mackinac walking tour taking place down on the parade grounds of the Central Fort. It's going to be right next, starting right next to